"If you're a true cowboy, ride my stallion," says the widow. 25 men failed, silent cowboy won. The sun was just starting to climb over the dusty horizon of Red Rock, a small western town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The streets were lined with wooden buildings, their signs creaking in the morning breeze, horses stamped impatiently outside the saloons and general stores, and the smell of fresh bread and smoke from the blacksmith's forge mixed in the air. People were going about their daily work, but today there was a buzz that ran through the town like wildfire. At the center of it all was the widow, Mrs. Cone, Clara Whitmore. She was a woman of strength and independence, with sharp eyes that could see straight into a man's heart. Clara had lived in Red Rock for many years, raising her children after the death of her husband. She had a small ranch just outside the town, and it was known far and wide that she owned a stallion unlike any other. He was a magnificent creature, black as midnight with a thick, shiny mane and muscles that rippled under his skin like steel cables. But he was also wild, fierce, unruly. Many who had tried to ride him had been thrown off, some ending up with bruises, scratches, or worse. The townsfolk whispered stories about the stallion, calling him the Shadow, and said no man could tame him. For weeks, Clara had grown tired of hearing men boast about their courage, their skill, and their experience as cowboys. She had watched the bravest, strongest, and most confident men of Red Rock fail one by one when they tried to ride the Shadow. Some tried to claim they could do it, but when it came time to mount the stallion, their confidence vanished like smoke in the wind. Clara decided she would put an end to the boasting once and for all. She wanted to see who, if anyone, could rise to the challenge of riding her stallion, not through strength alone, but through courage, skill, and respect for the animal. One bright morning, she stood at the edge of her ranch, her hat tilted against the sun. The stallion pawed the ground beside her, tossing his head and snorting clouds of dust into the air. Clara's voice rang out, clear and firm. "If you think you're a true cowboy, you can ride him." Her words carried across the fields, reaching the ears of the townsfolk who had gathered to watch the spectacle. She added, "Anyone who succeeds will be rewarded. Fail, and you'll be remembered as just another man who couldn't handle him." By the time the news spread, the crowd in Red Rock had grown to dozens. Farmers, ranchers, and curious townspeople leaned on fences and peered from doorways to see the action. The men lined up, each determined to prove his worth. There was Tom "Rough Hands" Riley, a burly man known for breaking in wild horses. Jed "Lightning" Carlson, who boasted he could ride anything with 4 legs, and Hank Mulligan, a cowboy who never let a challenge pass him by. They laughed among themselves, exchanging jokes and teasing the others, but beneath the bravado was a hint of nervousness. They had all heard the stories of the Shadow's ferocity, and each man knew he was about to face something far beyond a simple ride. One by one, the men approached the stallion. Tom Riley was first. He walked confidently up to the Shadow, patting his neck and whispering words he thought were reassuring. He swung onto the horse's back, gripping the reins tightly. The moment he tried to get the horse moving, the Shadow reared, throwing Tom into the dirt. He scrambled to his feet, dusting himself off and muttering under his breath as the crowd chuckled. Next was Lightning Carlson. He jumped onto the horse with a smirk, sure that his experience would carry him through. But the Shadow bucked and spun, shaking Lightning like a leaf in the wind. He hit the ground hard, rolling to avoid injury, and stood up with a red mark across his cheek. Even he looked shocked, realizing that this horse was not to be underestimated. Hank Mulligan tried next. He was careful, measured, and skilled, but even he could not stay on. The stallion twisted and lunged with unexpected speed, throwing Hank off and causing him to stumble into a fence post. The widow watched silently, her arms crossed, as the pattern continued. One by one, 25 men attempted the ride. Some fell immediately. Others managed to stay on for a few seconds, only to be thrown off in ways that left the crowd gasping and whispering. With every failure, the story of the shadow grew. The townsfolk's admiration for the stallion increased, and their respect for the widow deepened. Clara was not cruel. She simply had a bond with her horse that none of the men could understand. She had raised him with patience, teaching him trust rather than fear, and she expected the same from any rider. Watching the men fail was almost entertaining, but it also brought a quiet pride to her heart. She knew that anyone who could truly ride her stallion would have to be exceptional. By late afternoon, the sun had climbed high into the sky, casting long shadows across the dry earth. The crowd had grown silent, no longer laughing or whispering. They had seen what the shadow could do, and the repeated failures had left them in awe. The men who had tried earlier rubbed their sore arms and legs, their faces red with embarrassment and pain. Some left quietly, muttering that perhaps the challenge was impossible. Others stayed, unwilling to admit defeat, still hoping that the next rider might succeed. Clara walked among the remaining crowd, her sharp eyes scanning each man who dared to step forward. She noticed the differences in their approaches. Some relied on brute strength, others on loud commands, and a few tried to bribe or force the horse into submission. None of them understood that the shadow responded not to force, but to respect, patience, and connection. It was a lesson that few men of Red Rock had learned. As the afternoon wore on, a hush fell over the town. Everyone waited for the next rider, their attention drawn to the quiet determination of those who had not yet tried. The challenge was more than a test of skill. It had become a spectacle of character. The men who had failed were humbled, and the crowd was learning that being a cowboy was not just about toughness or boasting. It was about understanding, timing, and courage in the face of something greater than oneself. By evening, only a handful of men remained willing to attempt the ride. Each approached with a mixture of fear and confidence, knowing they were about to face one of the most formidable animals in the region. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Clara stood proudly, her posture strong, her eyes reflecting both the beauty of the day and the challenge she had set forth. The stallion pawed at the ground, his muscles tensed, ready to test anyone who dared climb onto his back. The townsfolk watched, leaning forward on fences and posts, their anticipation growing. The story of the day, the failures, the courage, and the stallion's power would be told for years to come. No one had succeeded, but the challenge had revealed much about the men of Red Rock, their bravery, and their pride. And though 25 men had failed, the widow knew in her heart that the right man, the true cowboy, would eventually come. Someone who would understand that riding the shadow required more than strength or ego. It required patience, respect, and a bond between man and horse. As the first stars began to twinkle in the western sky, Clara Whitmore looked at her stallion and then at the remaining men, her lips curling into a small, confident smile. She knew that tomorrow, or the day after, someone new might arrive. Someone who was silent yet observant, strong yet gentle, and wise enough to understand the nature of the stallion. The widow's challenge was far from over. It was only just beginning. The crowd began to disperse, some leaving with heads bowed, others talking quietly about the day's events. Stories of the failed riders spread quickly, and the legend of the shadow grew larger with each retelling. And in the quiet of the evening, with the wind rustling the grass and the stars sparkling above, the widow and her stallion stood together, waiting for the man who could finally ride and earn the respect of both horse and woman. The next morning, the town of Red Rock was alive again, buzzing with whispers and speculation. News of the previous day's failed attempts had spread like wildfire. People gathered near the edge of Clara Whitmore's ranch, curious to see who might dare to face the shadow next. The sun rose bright over the dusty streets, casting long shadows of the wooden buildings and flickering across the open fields. The stallion pawed impatiently at the ground, his muscles coiled and eyes flashing with energy, a living storm waiting for the next rider. Amid the chatter of the townsfolk, a quiet figure appeared on the horizon. He moved slowly, deliberately, riding a small, plain horse that was nothing compared to the shadow. His clothes were simple, dusty boots, worn trousers, and a faded jacket, but he carried himself with a calm confidence that immediately caught the attention of those watching. He didn't shout, boast, or call for attention. He simply rode, observing the crowd and the powerful stallion with steady eyes. The men who had failed the day before noticed him immediately. Some scoffed, pointing and whispering, "Who does he think he is? That quiet fellow? He won't last a minute." Others shrugged, unconvinced, murmuring that a man who didn't speak much must have no skill at all. Clara, however, tilted her head slightly, curiosity shining in her eyes. There was something about him, something in the way he moved, that made her pause. Unlike the others, he didn't seem arrogant or desperate to prove himself. He looked calm, focused, and respectful. As he approached the ranch, he dismounted slowly, his movements smooth and deliberate. He led his small horse to a post and tied it up before turning his full attention to the shadow. The stallion snorted loudly, tossing his head and pawing at the dirt. He was larger than the quiet man's horse, stronger and wilder, and he sensed a different energy in this new rider. The townsfolk held their breath, watching as the quiet man stepped closer, not with fear, but with steady determination. Clara called out, her voice firm but not unkind. "You think you can ride him?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. The man looked at her briefly but said nothing. Instead, he approached the shadow slowly, his hands open and relaxed, moving in a way that was non-threatening. The stallion's ears twitched as he sensed the calmness emanating from the newcomer. The crowd murmured among themselves, surprised by the man's silence. They had grown used to cowboys who shouted, slapped, or pushed their horses into submission, but this one moved differently. The quiet cowboy crouched slightly, letting the stallion see that he meant no harm. He extended a hand, brushing gently along the horse's neck. The stallion shivered at first, wary of this new presence. He pawed the ground, tested the man's patience, and tried to intimidate him as he had done with the others. But the quiet cowboy did not retreat. He stood firm, breathing slowly, moving with the horse rather than against it. He did not shout, he did not jerk the reins, and he did not try to force the stallion into obedience. He simply waited, letting the horse understand that he would not be a threat. The crowd leaned forward, curiosity turning into disbelief. They had never seen anyone approach the shadow this way. The men who had failed before whispered to each other, wondering if this silent cowboy might actually succeed where they could not. Some shook their heads, convinced it was impossible, while others couldn't take their eyes off him. Clara watched quietly, sensing that something remarkable was about to happen. The cowboy circled the shadow, keeping his movements smooth and careful. He studied the horse's muscles, its breathing, and its eyes. He observed every twitch of its ears and the slightest shift in weight. He had no need to rush, no need to show off. The townsfolk began to notice a subtle change in the stallion's behavior. His movements became less frantic, and the fierce glare in his eyes softened slightly. There was a trust forming, quiet and unseen, that no one else had managed to earn. After a long moment, the cowboy reached for the reins. Unlike the others, he didn't pull or tug. He held them gently, letting the shadow feel that he would guide, not control. He lifted one leg over the horse's back and mounted with a smooth, deliberate motion. The stallion snorted loudly, tossing his head, but the cowboy's calm presence seemed to steady him. The townsfolk gasped. They had expected another quick failure, another crash to the dirt, but the man remained on the horse, balanced and composed. For several tense moments, the shadow tested him. He leapt forward suddenly, then bucked, but the cowboy's body moved with the horse, not against it. He leaned, shifted, and adjusted with precision, responding to the stallion's wild energy with subtle skill. Unlike the others, he did not struggle or resist. The crowd watched in stunned silence, realizing that this man's approach was entirely different. There was no arrogance, no brute force, only respect and understanding. Clara's heart beat faster as she saw the connection forming between man and horse. She had never seen the shadow behave this way with anyone else. Pyar's, the stallion's eyes, which had always been sharp and suspicious, seemed to focus on the cowboy with something like recognition. The horse's muscles relaxed slightly and his movements became less erratic. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, amazed at what they were witnessing. It was as if the cowboy and the stallion were speaking to each other without words, communicating in a language only they understood. Minutes passed, each one filled with tension and awe. The cowboy rode in a slow circle, keeping the horse moving but never forcing him. He adjusted his position, shifted his weight, and used the reins with delicate skill. The stallion's energy remained high, but it was controlled, harnessed, and focused. The townsfolk held their breath, knowing that no one else had ever lasted this long on the horse's back. The silence was broken only by the soft clatter of hooves on dirt and the occasional snort of the stallion. After what felt like an eternity, the cowboy guided the shadow to a stop. He dismounted with the same smooth grace he had shown when mounting. The crowd erupted into quiet murmurs of amazement. Some men rubbed their eyes, thinking they had not seen correctly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The silent cowboy had done what 25 men before him could not. He had earned the trust of the wild stallion without harshness or aggression. Clara stepped forward, her eyes shining with admiration. "I did not think it was possible," she said softly. Her voice carried across the crowd, full of wonder. "You have shown true skill, patience, and courage. You are a real cowboy." The man simply nodded, his calm demeanor unchanged. He did not boast, he did not demand applause. He only acknowledged her words with quiet respect. The townsfolk began to surround them, eager to ask questions and offer congratulations, but the cowboy remained composed. He knew that true mastery was not about recognition or praise. It was about the bond he had formed with the shadow, the understanding that strength alone could not achieve. He had listened, observed, and adapted, letting the horse's instincts guide him rather than forcing his own will upon it. Clara felt a mix of relief and pride. She had watched so many men fail, some with reckless pride, others with brute force, but this quiet cowboy had succeeded through patience, understanding, and skill. He had proved something important, not just to her, but to the entire town. That courage was not measured by loudness or aggression, but by calm confidence, respect, and the ability to adapt in the face of challenge. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting warm light over the fields and buildings of Red Rock, the townsfolk slowly began to disperse, talking excitedly about what they had seen. Stories would spread quickly, and the name of the silent cowboy would soon become legendary in the town. Children would repeat the tale to their friends, cowboys would tell it around campfires, and Clara Whitmore would remember the day as the day a man of patience and respect conquered the shadow. The cowboy stayed behind for a few moments, patting the stallion's neck and whispering softly. He did not seek reward or recognition, only satisfaction in the achievement itself. Clara approached again, offering him a handshake and a nod of approval. "You have earned your place here and the respect of everyone who doubted you," she said. He simply nodded again, allowing his actions to speak louder than words. As he mounted his smaller horse and prepared to leave, Clara called after him. "Remember, a true cowboy is not just strong. He is patient, respectful, and wise. You have shown all of that today." He gave a small, polite tip of his hat, acknowledging her words, and rode slowly out of the ranch, disappearing down the dusty trail. The townsfolk watched him go, silent and awed, knowing they had witnessed something rare and remarkable. That day, the story of the silent cowboy and the shadow began to grow. It would be told for generations as a lesson in courage, patience, and respect. And for Clara Whitmore, it was a reminder that sometimes the quietest, most unassuming people are capable of extraordinary things. The morning sun broke over Red Rock like a promise of adventure. Birds chirped in the distance, and the scent of dew-covered grass mixed with the familiar dust of the western plains. The townsfolk gathered early, their eyes shining with excitement and curiosity. Word had spread quickly about the quiet cowboy who had gained the Shadow's trust the day before. Everyone wanted to see him ride the stallion, to witness the skill and patience that had eluded 25 other men. The quiet cowboy arrived just as the crowd was settling, his plain horse moving slowly through the dusty road. He wore the same simple clothes, his jacket faded and boots scuffed, but his posture remained calm, composed, and confident. He dismounted carefully, patting his horse on the neck before walking toward the shadow. The stallion pawed the ground, tossing his head, his muscles coiled with energy. Today he was even more alert, sensing that the man before him was no ordinary rider. Clara Whitmore stood near the fence, her eyes fixed on the cowboy and the stallion. She had seen him approach the day before and had been impressed by his patience and understanding. Today she expected a performance that would either confirm his skill or test it to the limits. "Remember," she said to the watching crowd, "this is not just a ride. It is a test of courage, patience, and connection. Watch closely and learn what it means to be a true cowboy." The cowboy approached the shadow slowly, moving with careful precision. He crouched slightly to show he was not a threat, letting the horse smell his hand and feel his calm energy. The stallion snorted loudly and tossed his mane, trying to intimidate him as he had done with every other rider. But the cowboy stood his ground, his movements gentle yet confident. The crowd leaned forward, holding their breath, as they had seen many men fail in spectacular ways. He reached for the reins, not with force, but with a light touch. The stallion's eyes followed his hands, measuring every movement. The cowboy whispered softly, a sound so gentle that the townsfolk could barely hear it, yet it seemed to soothe the horse. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted one leg and mounted. The crowd gasped at his calmness. Unlike the others, he did not fight the stallion's power. He matched it. The moment he settled into the saddle, the shadow tested him. He reared up, kicked, and spun, as if to say, "Do you really belong here?" The cowboy's body moved with the horse, shifting weight subtly, adjusting balance, and letting the stallion feel in control while maintaining his own stability. He leaned forward slightly, guided gently with the reins, and mirrored every movement with skillful precision. The crowd whispered, amazed at the man's control and the stallion's response. The stallion charged across the field, kicking up dust and dirt as his hooves struck the ground. Other men would have panicked or tried to force him into submission. But the cowboy stayed calm. His eyes never left the horses, his hands steady on the reins, his body perfectly balanced. He allowed the shadow to express his energy, channeling it rather than suppressing it. With every leap, every twist, and every sudden turn, the cowboy adapted seamlessly, his movements almost becoming one with the horse. The townsfolk watched in awe. The stallion's power was immense, yet the cowboy rode as though he were part of the animal, not above it. Children held their breath, and the men who had failed before muttered in disbelief. They had seen the quiet confidence and patience needed to tame such a force, and they understood at last that this ride was about connection, not domination. Minutes passed like hours as the cowboy guided the shadow through a series of maneuvers. He circled the fields, weaving between posts and trees, jumping over small logs, and testing the stallion's strength and endurance. The horse remained powerful and energetic, but he was no longer wild or unpredictable. He had begun to trust the man on his back, recognizing that the cowboy respected him, rather than trying to control him by force. Clara Whitmore felt her heart swell with pride and excitement. She had owned many horses in her life, but none had been as difficult as the Shadow. Watching the cowboy ride, she realized that his skill went far beyond physical strength. He understood timing, patience, and respect. He communicated with the horse through subtle movements and calm energy, showing that true mastery was about harmony, not dominance. The cowboy slowed the Shadow to a trot, then a steady walk, allowing the stallion to recover while still keeping him focused. He patted the horse gently on the neck, whispering words of reassurance. The crowd murmured, their admiration growing by the second. They had witnessed countless failures, but now they were seeing something extraordinary. A man who could handle a horse that had defeated all others, not with force or bravado, but with understanding and respect. The stallion responded to every cue, following the cowboy's guidance with trust and willingness. He no longer tossed his head or kicked out unexpectedly. He was alert, energetic, and powerful. But he had begun to accept the cowboy as his partner rather than an opponent. A crowd erupted into applause, amazed by the harmony between man and horse. Clara stepped forward, her eyes shining with admiration. "This is what it means to be a true cowboy," she said, her voice carrying across the field. "Not strength, not boastfulness, but respect, patience, and courage." The cowboy guided the Shadow through more complex maneuvers, testing both his balance and the horse's endurance. He rode the stallion up and down the hills, across the dry riverbed, and around the scattered rocks and fences. Each time the Shadow attempted to challenge him, the cowboy adapted, staying perfectly balanced and calm. The townsfolk watched in awe, understanding that they were witnessing a rare combination of skill, courage, and connection that few people ever achieved. At one point, the stallion made a sudden leap, twisting midair as he landed. Many men would have been thrown off, but the cowboy stayed perfectly in control, leaning with the horse and guiding him with gentle movements. It was a display of harmony so complete that the crowd fell silent, realizing that they were witnessing something almost magical. Children whispered to each other, adults shook their heads in disbelief, and the men who had failed before could only gape in astonishment. After what seemed like an eternity, the cowboy slowed the Shadow to a gentle walk. He patted the horse, whispering words of praise and encouragement. The stallion nuzzled his hand, a sign of trust that no other rider had ever earned. The townsfolk cheered, their voices rising together in a chorus of admiration. Clara Whitmore smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. She had issued the challenge to test courage and skill, and now she had witnessed a lesson in true mastery. The cowboy dismounted slowly, maintaining his calm and respectful demeanor. He did not boast, he did not demand recognition. He only acknowledged Clara with a slight nod. The crowd continued to cheer, clapping and shouting in amazement. They understood now that being a true cowboy was not about loud words, quick strength, or reckless bravado. It was about patience, respect, understanding, and the courage to face a challenge without fear or arrogance. Clara approached him, her eyes bright with admiration. "You have done what no other man could," she said softly. "You have shown that real skill is not about fighting or forcing, but about understanding, patience, and connection." The cowboy simply nodded, his calm smile showing that he valued the achievement itself more than the praise. He had proved that courage and respect could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. As the crowd began to disperse, the story of the cowboy and the shadow began to grow. Children would retell it to their friends, cowboys would discuss it around campfires, and Clara Whitmore would always remember the day a man of quiet strength conquered her legendary stallion. The quiet cowboy mounted his plain horse once more, patting the shadow gently on the neck before leading him back to the stable. The stallion snorted softly, following without resistance, a bond now formed that could not be broken. The townsfolk watched him ride away, talking excitedly among themselves. They had seen the impossible done, and they had learned a valuable lesson, that strength alone was never enough, and that true mastery came from patience, understanding, and courage. Clara Whitmore stood by the fence, looking at her stallion with pride and gratitude. She had set a challenge to test the town, and in doing so, she had witnessed something extraordinary, an example of what a real cowboy truly meant. The quiet cowboy disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a story that would be told for generations. It was a story of patience, respect, courage, and harmony, a reminder that the greatest victories are often won not through force, but through understanding and connection. And for the shadow, the wild stallion who had tested 25 men and conquered them all, a new chapter had begun, one of trust, partnership, and mutual respect with the man who understood him best. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across Red Rock. The town had never felt more alive. Word of the quiet cowboy's skill with the shadow had spread quickly, and people gathered in large numbers to witness the man who had accomplished what no one else could. Clara Whitmore's ranch was alive with energy. Children perched on fences, adults leaning forward with wide eyes, and men who had previously failed standing in quiet disbelief. The air was thick with anticipation. Today they would see if the quiet cowboy could master the shadow completely, or if the horse's wild spirit would still prevail. The cowboy arrived early, riding his small, plain horse as always. His movements were deliberate, calm, and precise. He dismounted slowly, patting his horse on the neck before walking toward the shadow. The stallion pawed the ground and tossed his head, muscles rippling like steel wires under his dark, shiny coat. He was alert, strong, and ready to test the rider. The crowd murmured as the cowboy approached, but he did not rush. His eyes were focused on the stallion, his posture calm, his energy steady. Clara Whitmore stepped closer, standing tall with a sense of pride. "This is the moment," she said softly, almost to herself. "Let's see if true skill and patience can conquer even the wildest spirit." She looked at the cowboy, admiration shining in her eyes. "You have already impressed me. Now show the town what it truly means to be a cowboy." The cowboy crouched slightly to show he meant no harm. He extended his hand slowly, letting the shadow sniff and feel his presence. The stallion snorted and pawed at the ground, testing him. But unlike the others, the cowboy did not flinch or attempt to control the horse through force. He remained calm, moving with careful precision, letting the stallion know that he respected him. The crowd watched in silence, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. He reached for the reins with a light, steady touch. The stallion's ears twitched, and his dark eyes studied the man with curiosity. Slowly, deliberately, the cowboy swung his leg over the horse's back and settled into the saddle. The horse reared slightly, but the cowboy's calm presence seemed to soothe him. He leaned with the horse, moving with every shift of weight, guiding him gently but firmly. The crowd held its breath as the stallion tested him with a sudden bolt forward. The cowboy's skill was evident immediately. He did not fight the stallion's power, but mirrored it, moving as one with the horse. Each buck, twist, and leap was met with precision, balance, and control. The crowd gasped with every daring movement, amazed that a man so quiet and reserved could handle a horse so powerful and wild. Children's eyes widened, and the men who had failed before shook their heads in awe. They had never seen anything like it. Minutes passed, yet the cowboy remained steady. The shadow, who had thrown 25 men before him, was now responding to subtle cues and movements. The cowboy's hands guided the reins lightly, his legs applied gentle pressure, and his body shifted with every move. It was no longer a struggle, it was a partnership. The townsfolk began to understand the lesson Clara had been teaching all along. True mastery was not about force or aggression, but about respect, patience, and harmony. The cowboy guided the shadow in a slow circle, then faster in a trot, testing the horse's endurance and spirit. The stallion's movements were powerful yet controlled, his dark eyes focused entirely on the rider. The cowboy whispered softly, words too quiet for the crowd to hear, but enough to reassure the horse. The stallion's energy remained high, but it was no longer chaotic. It was purposeful, directed by the calm confidence of the cowboy. Clara watched with a mixture of pride and wonder. She had seen many skilled riders, but none had ever formed this connection with the shadow. This man had earned the horse's trust in a way that no amount of strength or shouting could achieve. He had proven that courage was not measured by force or bravado, but by understanding, respect, and patience. The cowboy then guided the shadow through more daring maneuvers. He rode the horse up a small hill, across uneven terrain, and around obstacles, all while maintaining complete control. The stallion leapt over a fallen log, twisting midair as he landed, but the cowboy stayed balanced, leaning with the horse and guiding him with subtle movements. The crowd erupted into cheers and gasps, impressed by the seamless partnership between man and horse. For the first time, the town realized the full potential of the stallion when paired with a rider who understood him. The quiet cowboy did not try to dominate or force the shadow. He communicated through patience, timing, and respect. Each movement was a conversation, a silent agreement between rider and horse. The townsfolk watched with awe, realizing that what they were witnessing was more than a ride. It was a demonstration of true mastery and courage. The cowboy slowed the shadow to a trot, then to a gentle walk. He patted the stallion's neck and whispered softly, letting the horse rest while keeping him attentive. The crowd clapped and cheered, admiration spilling over into the warm air. Even the men who had failed before could not help but acknowledge the quiet cowboy's extraordinary skill. Children pointed and whispered, eager to retell the story, while adults exchanged nods of respect. Clara stepped forward again, her eyes shining. "You have done something remarkable," she said. "You have shown that strength alone is not enough. Patience, understanding, and respect can conquer even the most untamable spirit." The cowboy nodded slightly, his expression calm, as if the praise mattered less than the achievement itself. He had demonstrated not only skill, but the heart of a true cowboy. The cowboy guided the shadow through one final demonstration, circling the field gracefully, executing precise turns, and maintaining perfect balance. The horse moved with confidence and trust, responding to every subtle cue. The crowd was silent for a moment, watching the harmony between man and horse, realizing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. It was a moment that would be remembered for generations, a lesson in courage, patience, and respect. As the ride came to an end, the cowboy slowed the shadow to a gentle stop. He dismounted carefully, patting the stallion on the neck and whispering softly. The stallion stood quietly, nuzzling the cowboy's hand in a gesture of trust and connection. The townsfolk erupted into cheers, clapping and shouting, their voices echoing across the fields. Clara Whitmore smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. She had set the challenge to test courage and skill, and now she had seen a lesson in true mastery unfold before her eyes. The quiet cowboy stood beside the shadow, allowing the crowd to admire the horse and the partnership they had formed. He did not boast or demand recognition, only acknowledging the admiration with a calm nod. His actions spoke louder than words, showing that true skill was measured by patience, understanding, and the ability to connect with something greater than oneself. The townsfolk slowly began to disperse, talking excitedly about what they had seen. Children retold the story with wide eyes, and adults shared their amazement in hushed tones. The men who had failed before stood silently, humbled by the demonstration of true skill and courage. Clara Whitmore patted the shadow gently, feeling proud of both the horse and the man who had earned his trust. The cowboy mounted his plain horse once more, leading the shadow back to the stable. The stallion followed obediently, a bond now formed that no one could break. The crowd watched in silence, understanding that they had witnessed a rare and extraordinary event. Stories of the ride would be told around campfires in the town square, and to anyone who would listen. It was a tale of courage, patience, respect, and the quiet power of understanding. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dusty plains, Clara Whitmore reflected on the day's events. She had issued the challenge to test the men of Red Rock, but in doing so, she had witnessed a lesson far greater than she had imagined. The quiet cowboy had shown that true mastery was not about strength, force, or showmanship, but about connection, patience, and respect. The town would never forget the day a man tamed the shadow, without violence, domination, or pride, simply through understanding and skill. The quiet cowboy disappeared down the trail, leading the shadow back to the stable. The townsfolk dispersed, their hearts full of admiration and wonder. The story of the ride spread quickly, and the name of the silent cowboy became a legend in Red Rock. Children would speak of him with wide eyes, adults would remember him with respect, and Clara Whitmore would always recall the day her legend, the quiet cowboy, rode slowly away from Clara Whitmore's ranch, the shadow walking beside him with calm confidence. The town of Red Rock had never felt so alive. Children waved from fences, shouting in excitement, while adults shook their heads in admiration, still talking about the incredible ride they had witnessed. Word would spread quickly, and everyone knew that the story of the cowboy and the shadow would become a legend, told for generations. As they left the ranch behind, the cowboy did not speak to anyone. His silence was part of his nature, a calm presence that commanded respect without words. He had no need to boast or claim fame. He had already achieved what no one else could. The bond he shared with the shadow was reward enough. The stallion's dark eyes followed him faithfully, and his powerful body moved in perfect harmony with the cowboy. Together they were a team, two spirits connected through patience, trust, and understanding. Back in town, Clara Whitmore stood on the porch of her ranch, watching them disappear over the horizon. She felt a mixture of pride and gratitude. She had issued a challenge to test courage and skill, and she had learned a lesson of her own. True mastery was not about force, wealth, or boasting. It was about respect, patience, and connection. She smiled, thinking of the quiet cowboy who had shown the town what a real cowboy could be. Over the next few days, Red Rock buzzed with conversation. People told stories about the ride, each adding details that made it sound even more extraordinary. The men who had tried and failed before spoke quietly among themselves, humbled by the demonstration of true skill. They had learned something important: courage and strength were not enough. Understanding, patience, and respect were what truly made a man remarkable. Children played in the streets pretending to ride horses, mimicking the cowboys' calm, controlled movements. Adults discussed the lesson of the ride, using it as an example for younger cowboys who aspired to prove themselves. Clara Whitmore became a little quieter, reflecting on the challenge she had set and the wisdom it had revealed. She realized that the quiet cowboy had done more than ride the shadow. He had changed the way the town understood courage, skill, and respect. The cowboy returned to town occasionally, always on his plain horse, always calm and quiet. He did not seek attention, yet people respected him more with every passing day. The shadow, once wild and untamable, became a symbol of strength and spirit that could be guided by understanding rather than force. Riders who attempted to learn from the cowboy realized that listening, observing, and forming a connection with a horse was far more valuable than trying to dominate it. Clara Whitmore continued to care for the shadow, but she noticed a change in him as well. The stallion was calmer, more responsive, and no longer restless when approached by people he did not know. The cowboy's ride had taught him trust and the value of partnership. Every time she saw the shadow nuzzle the cowboy's hand or follow his subtle instructions, Clara remembered the lesson that had been taught. Patience, respect, and understanding were the greatest forms of mastery. In the years that followed, the story of the quiet cowboy and the shadow spread beyond Red Rock. Traveling cowboys, ranchers, and townsfolk told the tale, each recounting the incredible ride, the silent skill, and the partnership between man and horse. The story became a lesson in courage, patience, and respect for generations to come. Young cowboys aspired to ride with the same calm confidence, and older men admired the quiet strength that had tamed the untamable. Clara Whitmore often thought about that day. She realized that her challenge had been more than a test. It had been a teaching moment for the entire town. The cowboy had shown that bravery was not loud or reckless, that true skill came from understanding rather than force, and that respect and patience could overcome even the greatest obstacles. She smiled at the memory of the quiet man riding her stallion, a perfect example of courage in its purest form. The cowboy himself remained modest and reserved, continuing his travels and helping where needed. He did not seek fame or fortune, but his reputation grew naturally. Those who met him understood that he was not only skilled but wise, and his calm, respectful demeanor left a lasting impression on everyone he encountered. The shadow, now a little older and just as majestic, remained by his side, a loyal companion who had learned trust and partnership through their shared experience. Years passed, but the story of the cowboy and the shadow never faded. Children who had witnessed it grew up telling the tale to their own children. Adults who had laughed or doubted before spoke of it with reverence. Clara Whitmore continued her work on the ranch, proud of the challenge she had set and the lessons it had revealed. The quiet cowboy had changed Red Rock in ways that went beyond the simple act of riding a horse. He had shown the town the true meaning of courage, skill, and respect. Even long after the cowboy had left Red Rock for new adventures, the memory of that day remained. The stallion stood in the fields, calm and proud, a symbol of spirit and strength that could be guided by understanding rather than force. The town spoke of the ride with pride, telling the story at gatherings, celebrations, and firesides. It was a story not just about a man and a horse, but about what it meant to be courageous, patient, and wise. The cowboy's legacy lived on in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Young riders practiced patience, learning to understand their horses rather than forcing them. Older cowboys remembered that true strength was measured by respect and skill, not by size or loudness. Clara Whitmore continued to care for the shadow, often smiling as she remembered the day the quiet cowboy had changed everything. Time moved on, but the story endured. Red Rock became known far and wide for the tale of the quiet cowboy who had ridden the untamable Stallion. People came from distant towns to hear the story and to learn from the lesson it carried. They learned that true mastery required more than courage and strength. It required patience, understanding, and respect for those you worked with, whether they had 2 legs or 4. And so, the quiet cowboy's name became legendary, not for wealth, fame, or boasting, but for the skill, calm, courage, and respect he had shown. The shadow, once wild and untamable, remained a symbol of spirit and strength, forever linked to the man who had understood him. Clara Whitmore often looked out over her fields, smiling at the memory of the ride, knowing that she had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment that would inspire generations. The town of Red Rock thrived, its people carrying forward the lessons learned from that remarkable day. They remembered that courage was not loud or reckless, that strength alone was not enough, and that patience, respect, and understanding could overcome the greatest challenges.